welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 121. My guest in this episode is Andrea Hiott, and Andrea is a philosopher and researcher in the cognitive sciences, and she's written about and worked in many different environments, from the Peace Corps to the transportation sector to university classrooms and neuroscience foundations, as well as technology labs. I discovered Andrea and her work through her YouTube interview channel called Love and Philosophy. I had been researching guests that I was going to be bringing on, and she had hosted them, and so I started watching her content and really found it to be well done and well produced, and she's a great host. And so I invited her on to have a conversation with me, hoping that I could be a decent host for her. So, but she carried the conversation. She's an excellent communicator, and we had a very good conversation. So I hope you enjoy it. And we talked about philosophy, waymaking, and a little about the guests we've both hosted. So enjoy. And I'd like to welcome Andrea Hiott to the IdeaCast interview series. Andrea and I spoke for a moment or two before I hit record, and we automatically just started getting into this nice flow, and I know that's going to continue as we open up this conversation. But what I'd like to do, Andrea, first of all, welcome. Glad to have you
Hey,
here.
Justin. So nice to meet you. So nice to be here.
Well, I appreciate you being here, because in having researched you and watching some of the videos on your channel and reading excerpts from your webpage, I think we're going to have a great conversation. And to disclose, you and I have interviewed some of the same people and have been informed by them, and so I think we have a rich terrain to explore today. So
Definitely, yeah.
and welcome to the YouTube audience. Hello to everyone out there. I always appreciate your presence. I hope that the conversation that Andrea and I have will be of benefit to you. And I will have all information to access more of Andrea's work down below in the description field, so you can explore that if you wish. But again, welcome. Feel free to comment too if there's a question or an
Hi,
idea
everybody.
that comes.
Nice to be here.
Andrea, let's start out in a very classic way, and just
Okay.
I'll ask for you to share a little bit about yourself that you want to share that you think would help start the conversation.
I think for this podcast, from you and I just kind of had a little bit of an ecstatic sort of hello to one another. I think we'll just say I'm a bit of an explorer of ideas, but also of places, and I've studied a lot of different things. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for me to tell you all my degrees and stuff, but there's philosophy, there's neuroscience, there's also like heritage, technology, and with all that, I've worked in a lot of different fields, but I think the concentrating sort of theme has always been movement and how that relates to the way that we experience the world. And I do mean that in many different layers. Like I do mean the way we move through the world in terms of how we're afforded particular access geographically, topographically. But I really mean it in other landscapes too. This is part of my work. So when we think about what's traditionally sort of mental or emotional or relational, social with our family, these kind of movements, I think of it as movement. I've always thought of life and intelligence and cognition and what a lot of people mean by consciousness these days as one ongoing process that we look at through these different words in different ways. And my way of trying to understand that in my life has been through different forms of movement. So sometimes that's become very technological, and it can be in virtual spaces. Sometimes it's very technological in terms of automotive or aviation or motoring, which I think of that word broadly. I think of ecological motoring, but so there's, I would say the common theme in a lot of the work I've done is movement, and that includes the philosophy I've done in my degrees and also the neuroscience, because in the philosophy, I worked with mind as movement, starting with Hegel and David Bohm and their kind of ideas, and going into a lot of phenomenology, thinking of the embodied existence in the world as a movement, a process. And when I studied neuroscience, I studied the hippocampus. And if anyone knows, I love the hippocampus. And if anyone knows that little area of the brain, little seahorse shaped, of course, we have two of them in each side, but it's associated with navigation and movement. There's place cells and grid cells, for example, but it's also associated with memory. And that nicely kind of connects all those things I was just talking about in terms of mind as movement and also the way we move in the world and how it changes the way we can think and connect. So I'll just come at it from there. There would be many other threads I could say about who I am and so on, but I think for this conversation, it's that's probably the way to start.
That's a heck of a way to start too. And we were talking, I was thinking of animacy being a key feature of at least our branch of living systems. There are obligates to stationary life, stationary living, or how attached things and ground things. But and there's a term for that. I can't remember helio something and or hetero something. But anyway, but yeah, I mean that is a feature across the board in mobility, things like that, and to sense make through that lens of the phenomenology of movement and in so many different ways, as you said, is gripping and
And it can be
fascinating.
tricky too, because I think there's a tendency to think when I say movement that I really mean that the body itself is moving from point A to point B. Of course, the body is always moving. We're always in some kind of dynamic process, and that's more the kind of movement I mean. But I think when we try to study it and understand what's happening, whether it's literal movement and from A to B, or whether it's something that's like we would call stationary in those terms, but is of course always dynamic and moving, or if it's even our own thought process, which is kind of always in motion, then we sort of can really think of those still as some kind of statistical regularity or some kind of landscape, which some in some way can be modeled as a movement. So I don't necessarily mean that the body is moving from A to B and that's the only sign of life. I know there's a lot of studies about that. It's very interesting. There's a lot of overlaps and connections, but I really mean it more as dynamic, processual, and I really, really want to understand, get beyond this dichotomy of physical, mental, or that the body itself, if it hasn't moved a certain amount of inches or meters, then it's not moving. What I think of as movement and what I think of as landscape are really are really nested, is a nestedness, not a binary, not a dichotomy. And that's very strange and hard, and it's part of the philosophy I try to, because you have to kind of change language a bit to really get to that. But just what you were saying, opens that up in a way, not just thinking of stationary creatures as stationary. For me, they would still be moving through some
Mm-hmm.
kind of space. And I think
Oh yeah.
Levin and a lot of your conversations, you've talked about these different spaces and ways of thinking about it too.
Yeah, yeah. And also you had a guest on and they referenced like kind of along the lines of predictive processing where we would consider a primitive organism, but they're planning, they're imagining, if you will, and that's so that imaginal space when you scale up to what we heuristically call our higher selves,
Mm-hmm.
that imaginal space is also a kind of movement because then you're using that abstracted uh, you know predictive kind of imagining what movement is, imagining you moving yourself through time space, or imagining through whatever scenario. So yeah, movement is very complex and dynamic, I
Yeah, you're
guess.
moving through your own patterns and thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for us to think of it like this, but that's part of what studying the hippocampus, for example, helped me with, because you can kind of see how the body, this is generalizing it, of course, but it's true in a way that the way that the body and the brain, of course, I'm including the brain, and that's a huge part of it for humans, but it's not necessary that you have necessarily a brain, or definitely not a human brain, but the way that our body and being work when we're moving through something like conceptual space, reading a book or doing some kind of exercise, even virtually, that's in the way you were just talking about, thought based in a traditional sense. The body and the brain are doing similar, if not the same, depending how, I'd have to be much more specific if I was talking to neuroscientists, but it's something very similar to what we're doing when we do move, for
Okay.
example, from through our house or go to the grocery store. It isn't actually a very different process for the body. So it is a different experience for us is important and very meaningful, but we are in a sense sort of nesting. We start walking as children and we start exploring the world. At the same time, our caretakers, our parents, whoever are telling us a lot of things, all of those, we're moving through all of those spaces, through linguistic space, through our home, through our social space, what kind of people are what they're saying to us, how they're treating us, the gestures. For the body and the brain, that's all one space
Hmm.
of movement. But when we try to understand it, of course, we want to think about it in terms of, is it conceptual space? Are we talking about language? Because it's just so overwhelming to think of this amazing life process of all that we're encountering, and that becoming our movement through the world. So yeah, but I don't think it's a actually a very different thing to be. For example, once you become aware of your own thoughts and yourself as a subject, and you start thinking about those and becoming present and looking at your own thoughts, that's a very similar movement to trying to move through your house or find the grocery store when it comes to the way the body and the
Yeah.
brain are interacting.
Yeah, the firing and and the lighting up. It's almost like perhaps like watching a film. Would that be similar, where you're experiencing something, but then your neuromotor loop responses are kind of reacting to that film, like if it's a
Yeah, I
gory
think we've
film or something?
historically tried to kind of understood it like that. It
Okay.
feels to us as if we're watching something, or this gets tricky with philosophy and neuroscience because you have this homunculus idea. Like,
Oh
there's
yeah,
no
yeah.
one sitting inside of us watching our brain, but it does feel like that, and it helps us, I think, to understand what's going on because this is a very difficult thing to understand, and there is
Mm-hmm.
a reason why our language is built on putting things into categories and often opposition because it helps us to
Mm-hmm.
understand these kinds of things. But of course, what we're really doing is actually very similar to like when you walk through your city.
Mm-hmm.
From the moment you were born until now, you've been walking through very similar spaces, haven't you? So, like most buildings, no matter where you are in the country, more or less. There are some places that are different, but buildings look pretty statistically similar. Streets, pretty statistically similar. Parks, so
Mm-hmm.
on. And you find your way, you make your way through that by aligning with those regularities. And when there is
Yeah.
something different, you have to kind of adjust. And it's not much different than the way we learn. Let's talk about emotions because that's a very mental, sensual part of our life. And our emotions and the way we're treated, the way people treat us, what they say to us, all that from our very earliest days until now is a similar development
Mm-hmm.
through this emotional space. And a lot of it's very statistically regular, just like a city. And we learn how to align to that. It's different for each of us because we
Mm-hmm.
all have different emotional landscapes, but our body is adjusting to that. And so, what's emotionally kind of my baseline and yours is going to be different, but there are going to be a lot of overlaps. And there's also going to be things that are really irregular that would emotionally affect us in similar ways to if we're walking through the city and suddenly there's a incredibly different kind of um, event that happens or something that we encounter. So I hope it kind of makes sense that those are sort of similar processes for us, and thinking about them like that can be helpful because then we can start to understand um, how we're getting to these emotions, and we can look at our life as this trajectory through an emotional space and all the things that have taught us how to feel in these certain ways, and it
Mm-hmm.
starts to give us a little bit of agency in terms of maybe adjusting that a bit, or noticing why we do feel the way we feel, and maybe changing our paths and into directions that would have a more an effect more like the one we want in terms of our emotional
Okay.
landscape in life.
Mm-hmm. Seeking the positive valence versus a negative, predicting or trying to model what would be a positive affect or whatever from that experience.
Yeah,
Is
not
that what
only
you're?
modeling it, just like in our real lived experience, when you're in a conversation or you're in a relationship in a particular moment that okay, usually when someone talks to me in this tone of voice or says this, it sort of triggers all these things from my past that whoever said to me, my last relationship, my parents,
Mm-hmm.
my whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that path is probably the one I'm going to take. But if you're kind of aware of that path, then you might be able to have a moment to go, is that the path I want to take? And how could I sort of shift the conversation or this situation? Maybe I need to move my body literally. Maybe I need to move the conversation in a different way. And it starts to open up different paths that you can take instead of, because often we would just take the paths without knowing we're taking them, right? We've just developed
Mm-hmm.
those paths. Our parents or our whoever, our friends treated us in certain ways, and it's no one's fault necessarily, but we've got certain paths that we take, and we don't think of them as really that we can really change them that much. And if we're in a state of not feeling, feeling some pain or feeling needing to deal with some things on an emotional or mental, this goes for all those levels, then when we start to think of it like that, we can at least start to understand we've been on certain paths. Those paths were created by everything that came before, but it
Hmm.
doesn't mean we have to stay on them. Could shift a bit. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, I think about you and you've from what I gather, you've studied widely in a lot of different fields. And what are you doing when you do that? I mean, you're really opening up new ways of lived experience for yourself in a
Right.
sense. It's not just like it's some kind of mental world
Hmm.
that now you have studied philosophy or biology.
Hmm.
But you've probably changed your parameters of thinking, feeling, connecting. All these don't really separate in our lives, at least in my experience. I don't know about you.
Right, right. No, I completely agree. I want to touch back on two things, and then I want to continue on the stream that we're on right now because I want to open up waymaking with you. But two things
Sure.
to go back. First of all, what you said about the child introjecting and learning through observation and experience and mimesis is a type of movement itself, right? It's a movement into maturity. It is a movement into the social order and the acceptance of that order, and
Yeah.
that's critical to our survival. So I just maybe just
Hmm.
emphasize that a
No,
little
that's a
bit.
good point. It's
And
another one of those nested levels. Yeah.
yeah, and to clear up the sort of homuncular error in sort of perhaps a second generation or first generation perspective of how we process is that if would the 4E self in a cinema or in virtual reality have the same affective somatic reactions to something either very positive or something horrifying? That's is that something that is a kind of like you were saying, we could be sitting with imaginal thoughts and things like that, or we could be actually moving through time and space.
Hmm.
Would you say, in other words, would the media afford us that same movement process in the interior, again, in that 4E self?
Yeah. I don't think it's an error that you made. I think it's actually,
Well,
there's a
I
reason.
wasn't
Yeah.
invoking the homuncular thing to begin with, but I wanted to
No,
make
I know
sure
you
that
weren't. Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
wasn't,
No,
yeah,
I just don't want anyone to think. But
yeah.
I think it's actually really, really important that we do understand why these things feel so similar. I mean,
Mm,
the things that we create and share with one another, language is the start of it, but as something like a film or a book, I mean, what are we doing? Artwork. We're kind of creating this third way or this shared space or what I've called sort of a system three. It's almost
mm,
like a shared set of regularities that we can kind of agree upon and feel there's a way of sharing that goes on there. So it's actually very similar when we're watching a movie or when we're reading a book or these when we're having a conversation, all these things that are very much related to the way we interact with our own patterns. We
hmm.
sort of have conversations with ourselves, or we have this feeling that we're watching, visualizing. Um, those are the same thing. I mean, it's just that we're moving through the patterns and the habits in a different way. We're not, when we actually watch a movie or we look at a book, we have this kind of third space object.
Hmm.
Um, but, just in the same way you learn how to walk and then you kind of walk without needing to think about learning how to walk,
Yeah.
your body is aligning to particular ways of viewing, of reading, of talking, and you just replay those. We do it in sleep and dreams, but we do it also in our own just to continue making our way through the world. It's
Hmm.
it's 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 a skill the body develops. It's a way of staying alive, of dealing with everything we encounter. It's not anything separate or mystical, although it's incredibly awe-inspiring and incredible. But so is everything else. So is the fact that we're born and we learn how to walk and we go outside and see trees and like all of this, if you really think about it, is pretty incredible.
Yeah, yeah. No, li
Um,
life itself. Yes.
yeah. But I think there's a reason why, yes, like virtual spaces or
Hmm.
all of this
Imagine.
is a similar, yeah. And the reason a lot of people now think we live in a simulation or so on and so forth, it is those same patterns are repeating in many, many nested ways and at many scales. Um, and there's a reason that that feels so connected. It's not for nothing, because it is a similar process that we're going through to make our way through the world, to encounter the world, to connect with one another, to grow, to survive, to thrive.
Hmm.
And something like a movie and a book and a conversation, whether it's me and you talking or it's me kind of thinking through my own thought process, kind of having a conversation with myself. Writing is a kind of way of doing that. All of
Mm-hmm.
that is a similar way of dealing with everything we encounter and finding better
Okay.
ways to deal with it from
Okay.
my perspective.
So it's sense making secondary to way making. So it's the sort of reflection on the way
Hmm.
making process, perhaps. Is that what we're
Yeah, I
doing
mean
when we
this, yeah,
reflect? Is
I'm
that?
glad you brought that up. I mean, sense making is a really important idea, and it comes from a lot of different places. There's a lot of different disciplines who've used that term in different ways. But
Hmm.
if we think with like 4E tradition or coming out of an activism, and the Basque school and some amazing scholarship from people there like Hannah de Jager and De Paulo and all these people who are thinking about sense making. I do, I think the word sense making can be confusing only because people tend to think of it as already in this kind of mental realm of making like understanding or something. But of course, the body is in relation to others making sense too. That's part of their whole model. It's actually kind of
Hmm.
a relational dynamic. But I think the way making just works because it's in any landscape. As long as we have to remember that when we're talking about this together or when we're writing philosophy, when we're studying, we aren't able to capture the process. Life is ongoing, dynamic. We can't ever capture that. So
Hmm.
what we're doing is trying to think about it, model it, put it into these forms like books, movies, conversations that help us understand it better and sort of uh, set the parameters in a better way, hopefully, more healthier
Hmm.
ways. So waymaking, we can think of these landscapes as conceptual, as emotional, as mental, as physical, and it doesn't necessarily always need to be a human body who's understanding something with the brain. It can just be an embodied life that's encountering whatever it's encountering,
Okay.
and there's no choice but to make way there. That is what life is doing, and we can look at that in many, many, many different ways. So sense making, depending again, like because we could come at this from another discipline, like something like sociology or anthropology, or those terms are used in a lot of different ways. But if we want to think of it just as a kind of process of understanding, of making sense,
Hmm.
then it's the same process that we would be doing when we were making our way through a city or a town.
Okay.
It's just that now we're doing it through something like this relational landscape. If we're talking about humans, the way we've learned to interact with people and those relational dynamics, that's the kind of sense making, and we become, we're it could be kind of an entrainment or something that when we're in a certain kind of relation, if I'm with certain friends from uh, high school or something, I'm having a different sense making than I might if I'm in an academic circle or if I'm with my family or
Hmm.
so on. And so you have these relational landscapes that then open up, and you're making sense of those, but all of that is a form of waymaking. So I see these as nested together. It's
Hmm.
more just that the waymaking opens it up for me to all different kinds of bodies, species, scales, and all different kinds of landscapes. But there's a very similar and rich connection there that I'm definitely not trying to say it's in any way contrary to that. It's just maybe even a way of agreeing with that and thinking it through at even more scales.
Hmm. And since meeting your work, and having waymaking come to light, I have been working, excuse me, on a, like you just said, it's they work together. So I'm working on like a synthesis project because, then there's meaning after that. So I have two orders of
Hmm.
sense making. There's the sensate the onboarding of information through the sense organs, if you will,
Hmm.
and then there's the sense making of that in this sort of psycho in the cognitive sense, psycho emotional or psycho social, or however it's playing
Hmm.
out. And
Yeah.
then I'm trying to integrate waymaking into that because it's so new to me, and you're helping me with these with explaining it. But
Hmm.
yeah, I like
Tell
that.
me how
I
you think of it, and like,
well, I
because for me
again,
the sensory body is another thing that we often separate it. We think there's sight, there's hearing, there's
mm,
touch, and again, those are ways we need to kind of separate the body in order to understand it. There's nothing wrong with that. But
yeah,
in the actual process itself, these things are not separate, and they're not in the brain either.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
all happening at once. So
yeah.
I don't think you have like a choice between being sensory and being a body. A body is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sensory, you know.
Yeah.
So that's another kind of thing with the sense making. That's life, but we're also the body is senses in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a sense, yeah. But tell me what your kind of what's your where did you come from
Well,
on this and what do you use it for?
Well, with respect to the four E's, and what you just clarified is that that I have to generate a useful fiction to say that I am onboarding from the environment. But I love Vervaeke's transjectivity, where I am the environment, I am in union, or there is a unitary nature there that I have to cellularize and make sense of in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it gets sticky semantically because again, we do,
Mm-hmm.
but I call it, it's a false dichotomy. It's a useful fiction. It's a what I would call a useful narrative, to say that, light is coming in here, and tactile things are happening here, sensate things through whatever else. And then I have to, pathologies aside, try to order that and try to make sure that that's, what's going on. So I almost, if I were to try to order things, and I would probably do it in a very Western linear way, is to say that waymaking is primary because what is afforded to us by the sensory motor loop is, because we are waymaking. So in other words, if I had to categorize, I guess I would say that waymaking is the way, and that the sense, uh, things come to us by way of sense, onboarding, and then we make sense of that sense. And then perhaps from that, if we abstract up, that we can say that meaning can be derived from that. But sense and meaning are connected. And obviously waymaking and sense making are, perhaps interdependent, or perhaps that sense making is obliged to that. So that's probably my first crude crack at it, because I really haven't had time to really think,
No,
because
no,
your
no.
work is fairly
Yeah.
new to me. In fact, our having worked with Richard, Watson is how I got to know your work. I watched your interview with him, which was absolutely incredible, and I would highly recommend it to the YouTube audience, because Richard's an amazing guy. In fact, I
Yes.
have him coming up with, Matt Siegel pretty soon, so
Oh,
there's a
that'll
little
be interesting.
cat out of the bag. Yeah, Matt. It started because of illusionism. Matt was sympathetic to Keith Frankish's work, and I've kind of resisted Frankish for the longest time. And I'm like warming up, and I'm like, okay, I could be a weak
Yeah.
illusionist, but um, that got me talking to Matt, and I was like, Matt, do you want to talk to Richard? And he's like, yeah, that would be cool, because he's studied Richard's, thesis. So, anywho, not to go on a long tangent, but um, I like
That'll be
the.
a wonderful conversation.
Wouldn't
Yeah.
that be neat? I love
Yeah,
Matt's
yeah.
work, and Matt's a
Hmm.
wonderful person, so I'm really looking forward to that.
He's with more the Whitehead and process
Yeah,
oriented. Yeah.
process. Yeah, which I love because I don't go all the way necessarily into the metaphysics, maybe, or the ontological, ground
Hmm.
floor. But what Whitehead, I think, was trying to do is really poetic, beautiful, very mathematician oriented. He's doing, and he's borrowing from the tradition. I mean, he's sort of eternal objects or Platonic forms. That's a nice heuristic for all. So I love the poetry of what he does, and it's a good way, process relational. I mean, that really sums a lot of things. And that could lend itself to way making, sense making, meaning making, and they don't have to be ordered in a particular way. But I do think that meaning is perhaps the product of when we way make, sense happens, if that's, I don't know how if you can make that a verb, but so I'll leave that and get back to you on that and see what you think. And if you want to, challenge any
Yeah.
of that and just say, no, well, what do you think about this? So
No, it's great because all these are inspirations for me too. Of course, Whitehead, process, even into kind of Mark Burkhardt. I don't know if you read his ideas about
no,
process, and
no.
it might be interesting for you,
Okay.
but the very word process and the philosophy behind that,
Hmm.
and also the cognitive science kind of relative to it has been is very inspiring for me. And yeah, you mentioned a lot of different isms, and there's all this kind of the illusionism and panpsychism and all these,
Yeah.
and inactivism. And I try not to choose one of those
Yeah.
because we're often said we're supposed to choose, especially in academic philosophy. And I do understand that they do lead to different descriptions.
Mhm.
But I guess what I'm really trying to do is push at that linear dichotomous structure where we even those of us who say we are process oriented or whatever, we often end up in these debates or talks that are one side or the other, because of we have this history that has kind of put us in this
Mhm.
way, and our language itself and the way that our disciplines have been set up has that in it, and it's very hard to disentangle yourself from it. Also, you kind of, in philosophy, you debate something, and that's how sort of how you get ahead. So you usually
Mm-hmm.
end up, it's easier, let's say, to take some kind of stance against something
Mm-hmm.
and argue against it. But I think what I'm trying to do, and the reason I did choose way and making, because in my neuroscience work, I thought about it as navigation, but way before I'd ever even heard of,
Okay.
I don't know what Michael Levin was doing at the time, but I mean, now I've seen that a lot of different people think of whatever intelligences are as something like what I was trying to say then, which I think is a good sign that a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are starting to talk of it like that. But the reason I changed to way making instead of navigation is because in different disciplines, navigation means something very specific,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be very much related to the human body, for example, and having a
Right.
goal and all of this. And so I do think it's just a framework. Again, I don't like a lot of this conversation. It almost seems like we have to choose between all of these. For me, it's more what are you trying to understand and what are you
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out?
Mm-hmm.
And which of these helps you in the most way? So why do we have to choose always between everything is
Yeah.
whatever we describe as consciousness,
Yeah.
or everything is material, when a
Right.
lot of the time what people are defining as material and consciousness could almost be the same thing. So we get in these loops. It's wonderful. Critical thinking, by the way, I highly
Mm-hmm.
support. I think
Mm-hmm.
everyone should do a philosophy degree just to have to learn how to
Yeah.
debate and talk to one another. It's worth it for that. But when it comes to something like being in pain or having some sort of mental illness or needing to uh, address some of the incredible challenges we face now, whether it's politically or in terms of the way we relate socially as different countries or the environment,
Mm-hmm.
which I think it's kind of, we could say we need philosophy has a big part to play in that, as does science and everything else. For me, what I want to do is break open that framework of having to choose sides
Yeah.
and let us all respect each other a little bit. So that's why I use way, because you could think of it as the Tao, and
Yeah.
there's a million different ways. There's no one way. If you find the way, it's the wrong way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you can't name the way, but
Yeah.
we all have a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we all need a way.
Yeah.
And so you need to be able to hold that paradox, that seeming paradox of
Yeah.
that something like illusionism or something like panpsychism or something like computationalism or something like an activism could be helpful,
Mm-hmm.
all depending on how you've gotten into this position you're in and where you're trying to go. And just because you get some help from one of those or you figure something out from one of those doesn't mean you need to discount everything you've ever learned from the others. You
Mm-hmm.
always have to make a choice in that moment and you have to be able to support it and back it up. You can't just kind of put the responsibility on the ism.
Yeah.
Um, However,
Excuse me.
it doesn't necessarily mean that one person or one philosophy has figured everything out and you now just choose that and that's going to take you to the right place. I think I understand that we've gotten into a mindset where we feel like we have to do that as academics and even as
Mm-hmm.
people on Facebook where we have to decide if we like or don't like something, or,
Yeah.
we have this feeling like we always have to choose a side. And I don't want I want to explode that a bit. So what
Yeah.
I'm really trying to do is pretty radical in that sense because I really am trying to kind of develop a language that's a little bit more of a complex systems way of thinking about all this.
Yeah. And that's where I'll end up being your cheerleader and rooting you on from the sidelines because that's a project that I've undertaken in my so I have a very obsessive personality and I'm very hyperactive. So I like to throw as many balls in the air and I might catch one or two. So,
Yeah, well,
but the
you're living a kind of seeming
oh
paradox, right?
oh yeah yeah yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I'm trying to channel that chaotic mess that's going on and but it affords me the ability to do exactly in my crude way what you just described, which I think is a huge categorical error that we make here in the West, and I hope whatever it is, wherever we are, that yeah, like you said, we have these hard binaries and false dichotomies and false dilemmas that emerge from that, and
Yeah.
to keep invoking Vervaeke, but he calls it propositional tyranny because we're locked in that one P
Mm.
of many Ps, And
Mm.
we don't know perspectival and participatory knowing, and that is where we could engage with things like the Tao or the union of opposites, as Heraclitus might say, or the tonos that we can derive, which it is the tonos that matters, not the binary, and that
Mm-hmm.
that could
Mm.
be true. You know, it could
Very
be
nice.
things
Yeah.
that we. So that's a project that I've undertaken for my own little self to sense make or
Mm-hmm.
meaning make or whatever that is, or way make, into understanding that we can hold seemingly paradoxical ideas in appropriate tension. And it could be, we could get a big Cartesian graph going and there could be multiple vector points on this tension.
Sure,
It could
sure.
go into this huge interest, it doesn't matter. It's just, but like you said, we get locked into these and it makes great sport. I often say that it's like what do they call it? Professional wrestling or whatever
Yeah.
aberration of sport
And I
is.
don't think there's anything wrong with that as
Yeah.
long as we know that's what we're engaging in.
It's
Yeah.
infotainment. Yeah, it's just like
Mm-hmm.
these huge people get on stage and they bounce each other around, and that's what I get when I see it more like, okay, I don't want to be too polemical and vicious here, but like when with the atheist theist debate, to me is like
Mm.
professional wrestling. To me it's just categorical errors, it's talking over and misunderstanding, and it's entertaining. I love watching Christopher Hitchens do his thing, even though I think he's kind of obnoxious, but and sometimes Sam Harris is like that for me. It's entertainment, but it's pulpy. It's like I feel kind of dirty after, but I love it, because it is
Yeah. Well, there's,
intellectual
yeah.
debate. I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's just discourse, and you can
Mm.
derive from that maybe what dialectic looks like, or maybe what healthy argumentation looks like. But the matter that is being discussed to me is just like, it's insoluble. So
Well, yeah, it can get, so it becomes emotional and it becomes
yeah,
where you, like sports or something, where you sort of take sides and you
yeah.
feel invested in that
Excuse
person,
me.
not that person sort of winning or that
Mm-hmm.
side winning. And I don't think there's like all that is wrong. There's a place for all that.
Yeah.
Just, however, I think what I'm saying is, so you're making sense of those things, and that is a way you're making through the world. So
Right.
it's a way you're making through whatever might be turning you and maybe making you happy or bringing you
Mm-hmm.
joy or bringing you a
Mm-hmm.
kind of peace or dealing with the things that, physical or which I include in that mental, emotional, and everything that, when you make sense of something like a debate like that, it's at another nested scale, a way you're making through these your own
Mm-hmm.
life. But
Mm-hmm.
you can also just like identify with that, whether it's a religion or it's a speaker. I'm not just saying you, all of us, right?
Yeah.
We feel we, for example, if we watch someone and we feel that rush of identification, or maybe they say something that, oh yes, that's right. Then because we've kind of got this linear, dichotomous structure that we're embedded in, because
Mhm.
for whatever reason, that's what we're embedded in, we begin to think everything they say must have to be right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we must defend everything they say. And for them too, that's hard. They need to then be perfect somehow. And they have to take on a role and they have kind of, they can't, they need to not let you down, or they need to be this person that inspired you. All of that gets very complicated. And it can take away from that way that it opened for you in your life,
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
believe that you then have to kind of identify wholly with it. But if
Yeah.
you instead you understand it's one way, it's one scale, it's very helpful in this way, it might not be helpful in the other way. Tomorrow is a new day. We're all here to try to help each other and to engage in this process together, not to take sides necessarily and choose, but just in the same way as sports, it can be very helpful to take those sides and have
Mm-hmm.
to kind of commit, engage yourself, learn how to think critically, put these things to the test. Both of those things are good, right? But not in some kind of forever sense of now we can only use uh, that way for all these
Yeah.
other situations that arise. So there's always many possibilities, and helps us be a little more gentle with each other while at the same time being not being too lax. So there's always that balance. We do want people to think critically and have to explain themselves. At
Right.
the same time, we don't need them to have every answer to everything all the time.
Mm-hmm.
uh yeah, or be right all the time, or whatever. But
Yeah. I think that adherence to a person's an intellectual who presents ideas, and then the following that arises from that speaks to impulses and sort of archetype building that we have. And I'm maybe getting a little young in here, but it seems like it draws something out of us when we adhere to a belief as delivered by or prescribed by a person, and that invokes these sort of it's a civil religion or whatever you want to call it that's emerging.
Mm,
This I call it will to spirit in a sense. It's like this
mm. Sounds
seeking a
very
trans
Hegelian.
yeah, seeking a transcendence, and I naturalize that transcendence, but seeking that transcendence through that person, through those ideas, and then we adhere to that, and then we
Mm,
may not recognize or be self-aware that that's a dogma building up, and like you said, that waymaking, and let's bring in predictive processing and active inference into this, that we update our priors, and so that when you
mm-hmm.
attach to something, it makes it a little more difficult to update the priors, and there's where maybe the tonos cannot necessarily express itself as it could in a healthy way express itself.
Mm,
That's why I was sort of seriously jokingly telling you before we hit record that I love Pyrrhonian skepticism, because their tagline is epoche leads to ataraxia, and that's all I ask of life. Is I don't want to be happy or sad. I just want to be in a state of well-being where there may be fluctuations where I can be happy and sad, but I go back to this steady state. Excuse me. And that's one of my mechanisms, is to just say, well, yeah, I can't know. I can work with ideas and I can argue, defend something, but I don't. It's not me. It's not my identity that is attached to that, and all of my affect and all of my emotive faculties and all these other things that I think some people can possibly get invested in. So, and I
yeah,
don't
I
mean
think
that in
there's
judgment.
no, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But I also hear you. It's not that you just want to be kind of neutral and numb or something.
Right.
You're developing a way in which you can be present in the world, and that the happiness or the joy, I guess, you would like to feel. But it's not whether you're riding the wave or the wave is riding you. You can still experience a kind of presence, or maybe even a sort of joy, or
Mm-hmm.
a sort of motivation, a sort of, flow with life
Yeah.
that isn't taking it too personally, isn't
Yeah.
attached to it, and
Right.
too attached to it. Um, but as you were talking, I was thinking, of a couple of things. One thing about the philosophy that I try to, or the framework I'm more or less I'm putting, bringing together a lot of different ideas that already exist, and sort of trying to shine a light on the fact that we already have this other way we could be looking at all of this, in a more nested way, and that in many different disciplines, a lot of people are doing this. A lot of people we've talked to are doing similar
Mm-hmm.
things. One motivation behind that is that it's so easy for us to assume that when we're having an argument, or when we're watching an argument, or when we're reading an artwork, or we're whatever, any of these
Mm-hmm.
things, that everyone around us is having the same experience as us. We somehow we think of things as separate, and like floating separately, as if materialism is floating separately, and so is idealism, and so is,
Mm-hmm.
and similar to our own life. So we don't realize that we're all coming from a continuous development that's very different. Even if we all share so many, we do share the world. I don't want to get into some debate about realism, but let's
Mm-hmm.
think of the city again. We can share the same city,
Yeah.
statistical regularities, the same buildings, whatever. But I'm going to have a very different experience of that than you, based on everything that's happened to me since I was born, my history, my economics, my heritage relative to that place. But often when we're together in these spaces, even virtual spaces, we're just assuming everyone has the same development as us because we share these
Mm-hmm.
spaces,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't, because we've all made our way differently. Everything that everyone said to you, every book you've read, every person that's been in your life, every opportunity, every all of that has made you in that moment experience that moment in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's beautiful. And everyone around you probably shares a lot of it, but also has a very different, at least even if it's 10% different, it's very different,
Mm-hmm.
bringing all that they're bringing together. So when we have these kind of dichotomies and linear ways of thinking, it's too hard. We either say you see it my way or you don't,
Yeah.
instead of, oh, actually, this is a learning opportunity, right? What are you experiencing that's different about this? And how can we open a path between our two paths? You've made your way differently than I, but here we have this shared space together.
Mm-hmm.
How are we seeing it a little bit different? It opens up a lot. And I think what we what we love about the people who inspire us is that they open us to new paths, while at the same time they resonate with our path. And all of us are doing that differently with people. So that's something that's very beautiful about all of this, and that doesn't need to go away or change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Even if we do kind of open up the way we think about that shared space as being shared differently according to each way we've made, up to that point.
Yeah. Okay, here's a big question. How do you reckon that we can we can penetrate the culture, scale this kind of thinking? So again, this is tedious, but I'll bring up Vervaeke's propositional tyranny. How do we frame break that? How do we then uh, make that accessible or palatable, or even create a lure of a sorts into the intellectual commons, if you will, or the psychosocial space? What does that look like? Do you imagine that sometimes, like what you just said? How does that way make itself into the commons?
I think it's beginning to happen now. A lot of the
Okay.
people you've mentioned,
Okay.
this very space that we're sharing,
Hmm.
and the fact that now so many people can add their voices, and that you can kind of find these different trajectories online and begin to discover them. It's possible, but of course the opposite is possible too. We can get into our silos and we just get the same algorithm over and over and over
Mm.
again. But the way I really think of it is, I think that's why I do try to use language that can be used in many different disciplines and many different walks of life. You don't need to necessarily be a neuroscientist or a philosopher or whatever to understand what is meant by something like waymaking.
Hmm.
However, if you want to come at it that way, then you're going to get a very different kind of
Okay.
layering of it. But I do think it gets down to opening ourselves to opening language, um, opening the way that conversations take place towards not being less binary and less noticing it and opening to it. It could be happening with something like technology. Of course, it's always could go either way.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like a very practical sense, it for me just comes down to something like the way that we, when we're in a conversation, understand that we're each coming at it from different ways and kind of open that space and be able to feel comfortable enough with each other to explore the space from our different places. It's more of a mindset. It's more of a shift in the way we think. And I do think it's connected to our technology and
Mm.
our media and all of that. So I would say the real biggest shift, the most widespread, would come through something like book or movies or the way that social media is um, understood and
Hmm.
used and developed. But again, it's these things are kind of looping in and out of each other. So, for example, the more kind of conversations we have, um, where we start to understand a more dynamical, complex nestedness when it comes to what intelligence is, what
Hmm.
consciousness is,
Hmm.
what what meaning is.
Yeah.
Uh, if we do that on many different levels, it does become more normal, and it changes the things we consume, and it changes what we want from something like technology and media. What do you, I guess to really address it, it would be like we could zoom in on a particular challenge that you think you face or young people face or the world faces.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do have existential concerns, not for myself. I'll be 55 this year. I've lived a good full life, and if the world goes to hell tomorrow, I can die in peace. But I feel bad for somebody who's
Well, that's a
17.
beautiful thing to say that
Oh yeah,
that
yeah.
you feel that way. How did you get
Yeah.
that?
Well, okay. So I could go on a tangent, but again, meeting Mike Levin's work taught me about cellularity and undifferentiated unitary, say, reality or existence or whatever. And I
Mm-hmm.
look at I look at I look at scale invariance on what's going on um, with communication that he talks about, with organization, a default altruism that occurs when things have to stay consistent. And I use a metaphor because, again, symbolism and metaphor are important. That the human body of 8 billion cells on this planet, um, Homo sapiens or whatever. I call us Homo technensis, but yeah, I don't think
Oh,
we're wise yet. But anyway, the technical ape. But anyway,
sapien
that
is a quite a
sapiens
compliment.
a hubristic 19th century kind of where I think it was that looking in the mirror for the first time. Aren't we gorgeous?
Hmm.
Yeah. But anyway, that's a
Yeah,
tangent.
one
Tangent.
day we will be.
We
Yeah.
will be. We will be sapient once we get through the bottleneck, And so anyway, but I look at the idea that in a physical body, scaling back down to this person that's Justin, that I have cells
Hmm.
that live and die all the time, and they keep the system going. I have autoimmune condition, and I scale back out. Humanity has an autoimmune condition, and these are racial, gender issues, what cultural issues, disparities of attachment to ideas, and that arise from attachment to ideas. I'm not trying to
Hmm.
get on a soapbox, but I think that is an autoimmune condition. Cancer is warfare. So I do these scaling things, and so I look at me as an individual, and I'm a cell in the body. And when I perish, all I ask is that, like, I'm recording these conversations, that maybe that's a legacy that lives on in the extended mind of the four E's that I really stretch the meaning of that E, that
Hmm.
extended mind. And we talk about dead philosophers and people that are no longer with us, but that is still, moving through whatever you want to call it, time, space, or whatever. Um, and to me, that's what's important. So me as a cell, as an individual, has a dual responsibility of being that individual, being responsible, doing the best I can to be a good human. But then if I go away, it's trivial. It's not important that I go away, And so I try to frame that. Now, of course, that's me performative to an extent, because I want to live, I
Hmm.
want to continue on.
Of course.
I have a
Yeah.
will, but I am pragmatic in that sense, that if I get whacked in a car accident tomorrow and I'm not here anymore, that life will carry on, humanity will carry on. There will be other people who are trying to way make in a healthy, positive affect, positive valence kind of way, so pro-social
Hmm.
way. So I have confidence in that, and so again, I can, in some aspect, rest well knowing that I'm not necessary and I'm not important, but
Yeah.
nonetheless I am
Well,
necessary and important as long as I'm
yeah.
functional, and
I
above
think you
ground.
are again, you are necessary and
Right,
important
right,
because you're opening right now what you're doing with your life, whether you like it or not or know it or not,
right,
are you're forming ways for others
yeah,
who will come after you.
right,
You're doing that, I think, consciously with trying to have these conversations and understand the world differently and share those. You're opening ways,
yeah,
You're making
yeah,
ways, and they're not only for you. And quite a few times in this conversation, I've thought about that and it's something that motivates me a lot is
hmm
our conception of what self is
yeah,
and how we've also learned that that is some kind of a bounded static thing. And of course, we do need to think of ourselves that way. We are
hmm
responsible for this being that we experience.
right,
And at the same time, however, we are relational, and every word you say to everyone, I mean, you don't want to think about it too much, but there is a responsibility in the sense that as we're making our way, those ways are not just ours.
yeah,
Everything that was left to us, we've had to encounter. And
hmm
whatever paths were created before us have influenced the parameters of what paths we can make our way through, whether that's literal physical movement
yeah,
or whether that's our education, our economics, our social relationships. All of that is continuous with all that came before us. And right now, maybe you just say a few things on one of your podcasts or one of your guests says a few things and it opens up whole other
yeah,
ways for people. This happens all the time. Sometimes
yeah,
it happens when I just go to the grocery store and someone I overhear something or someone says something and it opens
hmm
up another path for me.
yeah,
That's life in a way, and it matters, your life
right,
matters. Everyone's
right,
does. We can't
absolutely.
get away from it.
And that
But
speaks.
it can
Okay,
help
go
to
ahead.
understand you're a scale in a larger process because
Yeah.
for the reason you just said, it can give you some, if you can get to a peace with that, to understand
hmm
you don't need to be perfect. All you need to try to do, which is an ongoing process, is be present and aware with yourself and look at your whatever has been painful or hurtful as a road you've been on that was co-created.
Right.
Take the responsibility you need to, and then move forward. If you can kind of do that and stay in that flow, you can kind of let go a bit of all that judgment and
hmm
fear about something like death, which you brought up, because
Yeah.
that is a fear that you're gonna not that what you're doing right now is going to go away. And in fact, it can't, because you're creating ways that will continue on. It's just that it will continue at a scale that's hard to process right now.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it speaks again to that dipole and the tonos. And so that the paradox of self importance and self insignificance in a sense, because I think the self insignificance is a humiliating practice or a grounding practice.
Mm,
It is to realize that, as you said, what you put out has a reverberance. There's connectivity, for better or for worse. And also that, so I use again thought models or whatever, like a social stigmergy, and
mm,
that stigmergic process is decentralized, but it's all nonetheless connected.
mm,
And there's a movement, I would say, forward temporally, for all of us. And so I'd like to use that model of stigmergy to say that, we all impact what that informational load is that moves us forward. And so, as you pointed out, it can be for better or for worse. And there's also like a psychic kinetic energy, and I don't mean in the tea leaf reading psychic, like psychical, the
mm,
psychosocial self, that we
mm,
have that kinetic energy that we create together again through stigmergy. And so we are all kind of this unitary system, but nonetheless, each one of us as a cell, can be a
yeah.
good cell, or we can be a cancerous cell, or we can be an autoimmune
Mm,
challenged cell. And so, like I said, Michael opened up this whole new world of metaphor for me with that scale invariance on both intelligence, but also at our level of complexity, if you will, like the psychological aspects of ourselves, the affective aspects of ourselves, which could be debated and yada yada. But I see it as a very useful means to
mm,
take stock and put value. And that leads to what some people try to do when they waymake about the sacred and the sense of
mm,
importance in the human experience. When we talked to Richard Watson, he said something to me that just knocked me over. And he goes, he defined love as making yourself vulnerable to know another. And another doesn't have to
mm.
be another human being. It could be another living system, or it could be the system of the planet, and to know the other. And know, of course, is a huge word, but when he said that, I was like, oh, that's a
Oh
beautiful
yeah.
way.
I think I've had a few conversations with him, and the first one was this transformative change, and he defines love as, yeah, this kind of vulnerable mutual knowing too. And
Right.
I think it's beautiful because as you were just talking, I was thinking of one thing I really appreciate about the embodied, and especially the kind of the four E's, but the
Mm-hmm.
inactive and embodied traditions, is this understanding of fragility and vulnerability, um, that is in a weird way kind of a strength, because it is this precariousness. We do have this autopoetic kind of way in which we do maintain our own body, and that is, for a time, and stay
Mm-hmm.
alive, and that's incredible. But part of that is that it's openness, its precarity, its vulnerability, because we can. That is, in a weird way, why evolution works,
Mm-hmm.
especially through something like Richard Watson's view,
Yeah.
and why agency works. Because if you didn't have that vulnerability, if you didn't have that mistake in the gene code, or if you didn't have that precariousness, then there wouldn't be change and evolution and new paths, and there wouldn't be really life. So that precariousness and that vulnerability is actually the strength. And I think a lot of us are trying to find a way to be able to sit with that and let
Mm-hmm.
it be part of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when we're stuck in these linear ways, which tell us we're either wrong or right, or either on this side or that side,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't make us want to feel that vulnerability and
That's
sit with
true.
it. Yeah,
Yeah, that's true.
it
That's
makes it
true.
harder.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
feel like we have to defend ourselves, and we try to find,
Right.
you know.
Right. And again, the thing, and I'm not congratulating myself at all, but that just again to suspend that any kind of judgment, I guess. Also, I borrow from theology and the apophasis, and
Mm,
there's a rhetorical move called apophatics, but this is the religious apophasis, to know that you are in communion or interacting with something, but you cannot, it's insoluble, you cannot define it, but you know that you're in the presence of something. And the theologies, I'm in the presence of God, but I dare not define that, which, that God might be. But I love the idea that they're invoking there, and cataphasis, because again, you can put that on a dipole, and you can have the tension where you onboard information. Cataphasis is, to know and to prescribe or to dictate or something, or, however that works out. And then the apophatics is to say, well, I don't know. I don't know, but I know I'm interacting with something. I know something's
Mm.
going on here. I'm having these responses to that which I'm interacting. And I think again, if you can put that on this dipole system where you can move around and oscillate and have that freedom to move, that it affords you the ability to weigh make and sense make in perhaps a healthier way. And I don't want to
I
prescribe anything.
absolutely agree, and I think what you just described in with a slightly different descriptions is a lot of philosophy
Mm, mm,
from even something like Hegel, or the thing is that we're doing that at many different scales. So there's
hmm
not just this linear kind of opposition that we then synthesize. It's
Right.
more that the way you just described it, I think, was really good because you, as I was listening, I got that sense of it as a practice that
Okay.
think of the yin yang, think of like,
Ah, yeah.
I mean, gosh, you
hmm
can look anywhere, but there's always these, what we, they aren't actually just, you can't divide the world into two separate things, but what you can do is in a particular space begin to understand how two things are relating.
hmm
And that relational movement, which is itself always co-creating those two things and isn't actually separable, but if you can think of it almost like a practice through that way
hmm
that you just described, that movement is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's just that we've gotten stuck in thinking there's only, if we think of your life or my life, we're doing this dance that you just described, or this kind of
hmm
moving and becoming with so many people all the time. People we
hmm
know, people we read and don't meet, people we listen to. That's that precarity. You don't say anything and you don't take anything in that doesn't shift your way just a little bit because of that very dance that's going on. It doesn't shut off. And I can understand that precarity and that kind of the overwhelmingness of that we can need to just set aside at times
hmm
because it's
hmm
a lot, and that's healthy. But when it comes to these really, when you're trying to do philosophy or when you're looking at these challenges and something like love, love is that precarity in motion,
Yeah.
uh, and it's realizing you're a part of it and you're not separate from all of that that's going on in so many different scales and parts. And that can be the most transcendent, amazing moments of your life, whether it's being in nature and having a particular experience where it's some kind of a religious experience that you've had, whether
hmm
it's with, your lover, or whether it's like looking into your child's eyes, whether it's with your dog playing. I mean,
Yeah.
those moments in our life are that relation where we don't need to hold on to a sense of self, and yet we're
Yeah.
totally present.
hmm
So I think that movement is really crucial, and you find it in a lot of philosophy, people trying to describe it. Bergson, Hegel, Kant even in his way, but it got sort of solidified. And, you know, everyone's participating and giving something towards better understanding that ongoing movement and being able to see it as nested and going on so many different levels at once. And it can be overwhelming and hard to do. So I understand that we try to stick it into things that won't change.
Yeah.
But it gets
Well,
you know, it causes some trouble and some pain if we really take that as the way life is, rather than that we are part of an ongoing process, a living process that's doesn't start or stop with our particular idea of self.
hmm hmm that is such a seemingly intractable or difficult move to make, I think, to surrender the adherence to the strong identity and to make oneself vulnerable. And as I mentioned to Richard when we were talking, the I don't know the direct etymology of vulnerable, but vulnerary is a derivative of whatever the etymological root is, and vulnerary means to heal. It is a practitioner of healing. And
Oh,
so
that's
if
beautiful.
if we synthesize vulnerability, just like humiliating is a grounding practice, the vulnerability practice is in a sense, maybe it's a rediscovery, reconnecting, or a healing that occurs through um, being uh, brave enough and courageous enough. Because some people see vulnerability as, oh, I'm weak and I'll be eaten or I'll be beaten up or whatever. But no,
Hmm.
no, no.
Hmm.
It's really a deeply empowering move, perhaps, because
Absolutely.
right,
You
right,
become much more powerful if you can be vulnerable. It's that's what I'm trying to get at when
right.
if you're in the linear mindset, then you think, if you're listening to some kind of traditional news where you're either the winner or the loser, or you
Mm,
even really, that's why I like Richard Watson's work so much. He's getting us away from some kind of misperceived ideas of what Darwin was really saying or
Hmm.
what's really going on. But when you go deep into it, I think that's why with different religious practices or spiritual practices or philosophies, and also with science, by the way, you do begin once you can understand that movement and sit with
Hmm.
it and understand the vulnerability. Something like what I think of as real power begins to emerge. And it's
Yeah.
not that you got a million thousand follows or that you bullied your way into kind of having the conversation, like controlling the narrative of media or whatever, which we tend to think that's the real power. But if you're living that life, you know it's not real power. In
Yeah.
fact, because you can never stop. You must always
Yeah.
fight, 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 and it's not a real power, and it's not a real way you want to live. But from the outside, it looks like, oh, that person, maybe they became president or whatever, or maybe they have the most followers, and so it looks like the place you want to get. But when you're
Yeah.
sitting in that place, you realize it's not real power. Real power is more like what you were describing.
Yeah. I could almost use a metaphor of or an analogy of monetary wealth. And we look at somebody who's a multimillionaire and we look up to them and oh goodness. But they are fragile. They are very fragile. They are subject
Very
to the
fragile.
whims of the market
It's not an
system.
easy place to be.
Right.
Yeah,
Somebody who's
weirdly.
broke is going to be equally wealthy when if a financial system were to collapse. And so, it's like that power that they it is somewhat illusory. And it could be the negative connotation of vulnerable because to maintain that power, you have to continue exerting the violence or the coercion or whatever, or charismatic, whatever, to keep that going. And that's very taxing and it's inauthentic, I guess,
It doesn't, yeah, you don't, I think you don't feel, we've all done it, you know?
Hmm. Oh
There's
yeah.
a, there's a weird way in which you can bully your way or you
Yeah.
can follow some kind of recipe that's going to kind of get you where you look like you're successful.
Mm.
And if you haven't done it from a place that only you know is real to your intention, and it doesn't mean you've done something bad. Sometimes people just go for that because they don't know any better. And then they get there and they thought, hey, like I thought that's what I was supposed to do. And then they have to deal with the real vulnerability. So it's not
Yeah.
about blaming someone. But if you really want to have kind of an expansive, sensual, what I would say real kind of joyful and truly connected and sort of transcendent and transformational in the most practical sense life, you're gonna have to sit with that vulnerability and you can make millions of dollars and I hope you do. We all can. That's wonderful, but it
Hmm.
isn't going to change the fact that you're going to have to sit with that vulnerability and learn how to be okay even if you didn't have all that money,
Yeah.
even if you
Yeah.
didn't have that fame.
Hmm.
That's the place where if you're sitting in that place, you're feeling the real power because it's not you. It's that you've gotten to a place where you realize your connection with the world and your sensuality changes. I mean, I don't know about you if you've gone through something hard in your life and or you've had to confront your vulnerability, but if you can and if you can be strong enough to still put yourself out and connect and just be okay with who you are, which is not easy,
Yeah.
accept yourself for who you are and admit it to others. That's part of
Mhm.
the kind of magic is being able to admit it and say it and move on. But some kind of amazing power comes through that. That's not, you don't need to take control of it and you don't need to own it. In fact, a lot of people who feel that never even talk about it because you don't need
Hmm.
to.
Hmm. I'm looking forward to somebody rising to prominence who can deliver this message, and it it lands with people and it connects with people who and they'll benefit from that. But we move away from the aphorisms and the sort of the hippie sensibility about this. We are connected. We are dependent on each other. We are a system. Yada yada yada. And that's again where the this big light went off with Michael Evans' work and just drawing up all the immediate metaphors that I can from practical biology and what systems are doing. And so I look forward to that we can have those heuristics and these thought models coming out saying, no, 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 this, existence depends on this. If you want to get to the root of it, this is an existential issue that, okay, hippies aside, that this cooperative I call it like a default altruism. It's not collectivism because Michael warns about that. Don't top down collectivism. It's more a stigmergic process. Again, it's this
Mm-hmm.
decentralized intelligence that moves frame by frame by frame. And to what was it, Adler or somebody that says, like when we are oh Christ, I'm gonna mix it up. But anyway, Dave Snowden says this. He talks about Frozen 2, and
Mm-hmm.
he's like, here's a guy that's a curmudgeony old Welshman, and he loves Frozen 2. And there's this one sister, I guess it doesn't, I have never seen the movie, but he's like, the only thing I can do is the next best move, or some song. And I'm like, when he's, and Adler's, Freud's contemporary, Adler has some line about
Mm-hmm.
that too, about this sort of psychological evolution that I can only, and this is predictive processing, I can only make the next best move for myself. And if I'm not encumbered by pathologies that I have clarity in making that next best move for myself. That's not egoic, et cetera, et cetera. So again, if it, hats off to whoever it is that comes to prominence, that has the social cash, that has perhaps just a sprinkle of charisma and presence that can connect and get the attention economy, shifting. So in other words, it's co-opting the things we were talking about, like the coalescence of a kind of power in a sense, but done in a positive way and in a sort of lighty way that will catch the imagination of as many people as possible. I can't I can't think of somebody who's done it to that effect, but I almost think that's what's necessary. So it's like it's this union of this kind of thing that we just talked about that can go very, very wrong and lead people astray. But a little sprinkle of that, or a creole of this kind of connecting again with people, and getting their attention, but then being a good enough person to say, okay, now that I have your attention, focus on this, and
Mm-hmm.
here's a way out, a way making system that, if you're depressed, anxious, all these different things, and we're in a meaning crisis, meta crisis, or whatever it is, and you're aware of that, that, let's look at this. And so, I don't know. Here's to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it may not be an individual. I'll it could be 75, 80 people, like Karen Wong will
Mm-hmm.
say, our little corner of the internet. And you guys, like McGilchrist
Yeah.
and Vervaeke and Sheldrake and all these people that are, and Kastrup and all these guys are throwing out these ideas, and they all deserve a place at the table. And maybe there's a collective of that then captures through a collective charisma and a collective attention economy capture, so maybe it's not just the individual, it's a group that can rise to prominence in a very healthy way that doesn't go culty cult, doesn't go deification kind of stuff that traps people, because that's a real thing that can hamstring people.
It is, and it's not easy. And I'm really glad you said it doesn't have to be an individual, because I do think it's happening, and that
Okay.
I do think there's um I mean, in a way we just change the parameters of what is desirable.
Mm-hmm.
We're always heading into a kind of unknown, and right now we've kind of defined desirable in these ways that are, again, money is wonderful, but we even what money is could change, by the way, and
Right,
and
right.
like all of these systems are connected, and all of that is beginning to change a bit. But it's more about what is our intention and our desire. What do we want? And right now, if you look at advertising and so on, it's still mostly that we want, not me, but that, or you, but we as humans kind of want to be powerful in the sense that we're famous, or that we're rich, because we haven't thought through that too much. But I think
Mm-hmm.
everything's becoming so distributed, even like this little corner of the internet, right? Like a lot of us are kind of famous in these little corners of the
Mm-hmm.
internet now. And that, in a way, does something healthy to what fame is, because you begin to realize it's not about everyone knowing your name. It's about, are you giving people something that helps them? And are you in a community that helps you grow? And it takes away from needing to be the star or whatever. If you're part of something that's
Yeah.
resonating with you. And I don't think it's easy. And even a lot of the people that you just named, I think they must struggle with it a bit, because you do need some motivation, and you go into science or you go into philosophy with some big questions you want to solve, and it can get messy about how connected your name is to that, especially when you have to negotiate very real things like the constraints of being able to continue as an academic, right? You have to
Mm-hmm.
publish a certain amount of papers and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
But I do see it in people, very people who really do get it, that they're not a solitary self, and I think it has to do with a sense of space and time changing, like looking at time not just as our little life, but as being part of something larger. Science fiction can help with this, by the way. But, and so can many other things, religions and, like, but if you start to understand yourself as part of a different sort of time and a different sort of space, and like what you were talking about, what you said, where you feel comfortable. If you were to pass away tomorrow, you feel comfortable with who you are and that you're trying to give something. There's
Mm-hmm.
something, and that power of that I do see in people in positions of power, in academia, in entertainment, realizing that and being able to sit with it
Mm-hmm.
and be criticized, or deal with the kind of the annoying stuff that comes from academia, or just make time to talk to people
Mm-hmm.
about things, just to help, right? Not because they're going to get paid for it, not because they're going to get, more famous or whatever. I do see people trying to do that. Nobody's perfect, of course, but there is a distribution that's happening in terms of beginning to change those parameters. And that does come from science, that does come from social media and technology, and that does affect politics and economics. And so it's at least possible now that
Mm-hmm.
we can begin to orient differently and shift all of that. And all this is part of it. You having your conversations and all these
Yeah.
little corners of the internet,
Mm-hmm.
where people are doing what they care about and having conversations about what they care about. That's having, as we were saying before, a lot of reverberations. In what's possible and what other people see as possible and what they realize they actually want to orient towards and what is really desirable. So it's definitely possible. And it really does come down to everyday actions, and all of us beginning to prioritize a different kind of set of values and parameters for what we want to orient towards in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about tonus a lot, though. Maybe you can tell me this, because I heard you say it a few times now, and I'm interested in
It's something I
where that's coming from.
Yeah, it's something I'm parroting from Vervaeke and his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And but didn't show up so much in that lecture series. And I don't remember if after Socrates had, but in some of his interviews or dialogues or dialogos that he does with people, he'll talk about what we've talked about in the sense that we have to get away from these false dilemmas, false dichotomies, these kind of, and again, your work covers dichotomy in a great way, and it's something that I'll be cheerleading you on as you develop as an academic and an intellectual, and make your work into the world.
Mhm.
Anyway, so yeah, the
Thank you.
tonos, the tension that I think. And maybe some of Richard Watson's work comes into this too when he talks about the musicality or the layers that impress upon each other in an ontological kind of sense. Is that nature itself seeks this kind of appropriate tension.
Hmm.
Things fall into equilibrium, whether it's gravity doing things or the weak force, all the forces of nature doing their thing. And this is something that we don't have to have in this conversation, but I do want to address with you at some point is this deep, 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 deep beyond Thompson's deep continuity of self-organizing and coalescing and things like that. But to stay with Tonos, that it seems like if we are to uh, include ourselves in the natural order of things, that is what is perhaps a preferred state or a state
Hmm.
that is without resistance or entropy or friction or whatever it
Mm.
is. And
Mm.
so that to me speaks to one way of offering a solution into the kind of milieu of what is a solution to the meaning meta slash crisis. So yeah, so again, yeah, it's just it's getting that string just right. So then we pluck the note, we get a good C4 or something out of it that resonates with us because we know the effective value of music, and so we could use a
Hmm.
musical metaphor to say that a properly tuned instrument, whether it be a stringed instrument or wind instrument or something, that vibratory oscillatory pattern is that which is both affectively pleasing, but also triggering things in the mind or whatever you want to call it. I guess I'm drifting a little bit, but I think
No,
that's
you're
what it
not. The
is.
reason they asked about tonus is because I think I wasn't sure, I honestly, I have not talked to Viveki, and I haven't
Okay.
been in a conversation with his work very much yet because it's kind of new to me.
Okay.
So I still need to, but I think what I sensed of it is that that is what I was trying to describe, that the toneness or the tone or
Mm-hmm.
the music itself, we're
Mm-hmm.
all playing it, right? So when we act differently and when we speak differently and when we prioritize differently and when we understand power differently and all these things we've been talking about, the overall tone and the overall music is changing, at least in these little corners, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
those little corners are touching all other corners. So you have a shift that's happening. I call it an
Mm-hmm.
ecological orientation, like
Okay.
orienting instead of me as a self, me as part of many nested uh lives, life worlds,
Mm-hmm.
ecologies, and not just thinking of that in a mystical way, which is fine, but I really mean it like in a practical everyday life, how it adds to your life and how it um, opens up, opens you up to move past a lot of the things that have paralyzed a lot of us as individuals and as groups, including
Mm-hmm.
something like academia or economics or politics. So I do think these little actions that we all make, the reason I say your life is necessary is because
Yes.
we're all changing the tonus or the music together.
Mm-hmm.
And the more of us that share, that's why there's been an amazing thing that's happened with YouTube and podcasts and stuff that we can all now, we're on different sides of, we're on different, I'm in the Netherlands and you're in Florida, right? I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
here we are having this wonderful conversation. And this is happening in many ways. And that is changing the tone and the music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so there's something happening that we can do that now and that we want to help each other or that we want to open and know more and find ways to deal with all these ideas and issues. For me, that's a change of intelligence parameters for
Mm-hmm.
humans, but for the way we interact with other intelligences, the way the body, the health of the body, all of that, for me to get to Watson or to the tonus idea,
Mm-hmm.
we're there's a kind of a different resonance or a different music that we're starting to play together, I
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah. I am cautiously, very cautiously optimistic because of interactions with persons like yourself and the others that I've interacted with. I think that has potential to grow, and I think it has potential to have capture in a sense that there. I notice when something novel shows up, and I do watch the New Age community. I orbit around it so I can see what they're doing, and I would love to penetrate
Mm-hmm.
that community to bring in some of these ideas that aren't uh, capable of spiraling out into weird supernatural kind of stuff. They could be more grounded and a lot more productive. So, we skip survivor fallacies and things like that that could
Mm.
show up in these kind of practices and just make them more helpful, I guess. And that sounds very hubristic of me, but I would love that to be one accomplishment I could make is to impress upon people. Try this, try these at these people's side. And they're not my ideas. Try these ideas that these people have put out in our extended mind. But yes, I am cautiously optimistic. I'm also deeply, deeply, deeply concerned in an existential sense. And that's where I want to try to connect with people under 30, try to connect with these minds that are beginning. Somebody said something in a conversation the other day, and it was the Oceanic Film Festival I watched the other. It was in the
Mm.
Philippines, and they said we tried talking to the adults and it was, it just went flat and went nowhere. So we talked to the children and they are truly the educators. And it was about killing and eating turtles, right? And
Oh,
yeah,
goodness.
exactly, because it was a practice. And so the adults
Oh,
were, threatening them death threats and stuff because how dare you? We've eaten turtles forever. And so they went
right,
to the
right.
children of these people and said, um, there's a chain here. There's a system going on. The turtles are part of this, and they have a role to play. And so they just, without being preachy and pedantic, they just said, hey, this is why we're motivated to do this. And the children, unfiltered by, whatever's going on,
Mm-hmm.
dogma or whatever, that they onboarded that and they actually connected with their parents in some way, according to the narration, and that there were changes made. But it was a sort of oblique means of getting around to these embedded systems of thought in the adults. So that kind of thinking to me is a huge turn on in the sense that if there's a way to penetrate the psyche of the younger person to say, um, don't fall in line with what my generation did. Don't do what the boomers and the Xers did. And the millennials are doing good. You know, there's some really nice shiny places in the millennial system. You know, and I hate to be generational, but I mean, it seems like that there are things happening with millennials right now that are very encouraging. But then, you know, we're looking at Z and A now, and it's like, oh, if we can reach Z or younger gen millennials, Gen Y or whatever, that transformative thinking and that little onboarding of new ideas or whatever it is, you know, that if that can happen, then that's where I think, because again, I think talking to people over 50, there are certainly good actors, there's good faith people doing good work. I mean, that's the, you know, this corner of the internet is occupied by a bunch of 50 and 60 somethings, right? Gen Xers and
Hmm.
baby boomers. But like I said, the ones who are still struggling and still dealing with the meta crisis or whatever, I look more towards let's go to the youth and let them come on board. Because one of my ways of really stretching the meaning of extended mind is that the purpose, in a kind of Darwinian sense, of reproducing is to imbue upon these people, to have the introduction loop going, is that they are a better product, right? That they are, and not better in a judgmental axiological sense, but just that they live a better life, that their well-being factor or value is better than that. And I don't want to be too critical, but I think that they're inheriting things that were promises made by, say, technological advancements or whatever that are actually counterproductive in a sense. And I'm looking at that through my lens, so I don't know. But like I said, I just, you know, if we can reach them and message to them,
Hmm.
some of these good ideas, like the ideas that you're talking about with waymaking or Watson's ideas or Levin's ideas, and having it
Well,
stick, having
we're
it
not
land with them.
separate from them. You know,
No,
we
not
are
at all.
them and they
Yeah,
are us and they need us and we
right.
need them, all of us at all different ages. I mean,
Hmm. But
and
they're in that
because, yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry. Just one thought. They're in that
no, go ahead.
stage of onboarding right now. They're in the interjection stage or the
Well, they're
mimesis
making their
stage.
way like us and they have
Yeah.
less statistical regularity so far. But we're
Yeah.
opening ways. They're going to open new ways, but still, whatever their parameters are all these generations ahead of them, we're still setting those parameters in a way, just as they're setting parameters for us. It goes both
Hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they've had to deal with a lot of our stuff, you know, all these generations before them
Yeah.
that have set things up in a certain way. And we can't just now say, like, okay, well, hey, we'll connect with you and you guys solve it all because they've been through a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of these young people had to deal with COVID at the most difficult ages where you really need to be in human
Hmm.
contact and they
Hmm.
weren't. And that's hard. And
Yeah.
we all need to help each other. We need to understand they are us
Yeah.
and they need to understand that we are them. And we
Right.
can have an honest conversation about what we see in each other that needs healing and help
Hmm.
because that's the way we're going to get through this is to see each other as part of this same process and be because they have a lot of strengths that we need
Yeah.
and we have a lot of strengths that they need and they're not the same ones. So
Hmm.
if we just if they think, oh, the older generation should solve this for us, or if we think, okay, now it's all up
Hmm.
to them, the
Hmm.
young people, then somehow we're missing something, which is that we're all each other. And
Yeah.
I think that's that beyond dichotomy and that love, right?
Right. Right.
That how do we open those spaces between generations, between disciplines? I liked what you were saying just a minute ago about with your work, you want to open conversations between what might get characterized as something like self-help or I'm not sure what you said,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
new age, because
Right.
we still do this, right? We think, okay, there's young and there's old, and
Right.
then there's new age and there's philosophy and there's science. And of course, all of these words have real meaning. Science is
Hmm.
different from philosophy and um, it's different from a book that you buy in order to kind of that's called self-help. At the
Yeah.
same time, however, there's a layer to all of this that's addressing very similar issues from different perspectives. And I think what we've gotten into in the past few years, and maybe it's part of your project too, is that you're pushing against it or that you're trying to open a different way. That's certainly part of my research, part of waymaking, part of the that I post the conversations online because and that I don't stick to traditional uh disciplines or traditional like for example if you're having a philosophy podcast and it's analytic you shouldn't talk to these certain people, definitely not to somebody that might be called new age and vice versa, right? But for me, and it's a difficult territory, I don't know about for you too, to
Hmm.
negotiate opening to all voices and trying to find some way to communicate across those traditional lines towards what we're all trying to address because and I find love is the place for that because we can connect in that way and doing we're all wearing a lot of these different hats at different parts of our life.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if that's part of your kind of if that's added something to you to be able to look into all these different places and have conversations across those traditional bounds. But for me, that's been a beautiful practice. And I think applying that to something like age or something like these
Hmm.
other traditional categories can also be helpful.
Yeah. So with age, we have to recognize a scale and variance there, and you hit the nail on the head. And it speaks to that Filipino fisher person story that I was telling that you can't reach the adults right now. They can be reached, but not. But so let's do a subversive kind of technique to get there. And that's I think again the youth will teach us, and there's filial piety, and if they are looking to the elders, what are the elders providing? Are they providing false utopian yada 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 rhetoric or whatever, or just real scary psychosocial pathologies that masquerade as confidence
Hmm.
and beauty and all these things? But so yeah, so there's definitely this reciprocity going on there, and again, polypolar or whatever you want to call it is
Hmm.
going on there, and it has to be respected. But you know what you were saying with self-help, it just dawned on me. It's like, well, let's reframe self-help to be not the individual, but the self of humanity, right? So that
Hmm.
the
These
self-help is
other scales of
universal.
self, that's good.
Right. So even that little tweaking right there, when you have a
Hmm.
self-help scenario, you get into a circling practice or a contact practice or
Hmm. Hmm.
doing your chakra work or whatever. It's that it is not so that you can be even more fabulous on your Facebook or Instagram account. It's that you are now this more functional individual that goes into the world and makes this impact on others because you've made yourself vulnerable to know the other, or however we want to say that. That that
Yeah.
that you've polished yourself, you've refined yourself in a way, and you've helped yourself so that you will be uh, that person that then has that influence on the other person, or just rubs off on them, as they say. It's like,
Yeah,
oh my,
that you're
what a
strong enough to love someone. That's
right,
not easy, but what a
yeah,
gift, you know? Love,
yeah,
just learn how to love people and
yeah,
not need something back. It's hard, but it's also the thing that will bring the most real power
mm,
into your
mm,
life. And
mm,
as you were talking, I think a lot, what worries me a lot, or I think about a lot is
mm-hmm,
who are the mentors right now and who are all of us, but especially young people able to look up to
right,
and
right,
because when we're young, we're actually, even if we might think of people as we might say jokes about older people, actually I remember almost everything that was inspiring in my life as a young person was an older person I was reading,
right,
whether it was a philosopher or whether it was someone in my whatever social group I was in that I was looking up to. They probably didn't know, but that was my inspiration. And a lot of it was philosophy books or literary heroes or
mm,
musicians or whoever that makes you feel a certain way, that opens paths for you, that has made way that you now want to connect to your way. So the young people are doing that too. It's just, what are we giving them? Or and what are we, what are we doing it for? And
yeah,
those things matter and they are communicating through that. It might just be that it's not directly
mm-hmm,
visible, but they need it as much as we needed it, and it's coming
yeah,
through. It's it's
yeah.
it's it's there. So yeah, how do we let down some of our self guards, while also at the same time strengthening our community connections and beginning, as you said, I like that a lot. If we could, maybe we need like community hero and community mentor
Mm-hmm,
examples. Maybe that's
mm-hmm.
even happening. I don't know. Um,
I I don't know, but I would posit that that's probably happening because I think we all reach a breaking point, right? That, if you want to call it a dark night of the soul kind of thing, where we
mm,
just say, "Oh, I've had it," and so then the next step could be not good for you. It could be falling in with a charismatic leader who promises you all this stuff. And there's a lot of the guru types out there, they call
yeah.
them Malibu gurus or whatever, and that can happen. But also, but in potential, and this is where this is what I would like to vision and see as something, is that there is a community of helpful people who are informed and not going to abuse that um, relationship of I'm coming to you in vulnerability and I want to
Mm-hmm.
know what's going on. Oh, well, for $1,000 for a weekend getaway, I'll give you the secrets to the masters, or whatever,
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
line your
Yeah.
this or that. But no, but if there are people working in good faith saying, please come to the community. We are not prescriptive. We are not dictatorial. We are here. We're an open system. We are in communitas. I think as Jamie Will said, we're in a communitas, and
Mm-hmm.
you are part of that community, and because there is no separation in that sense. And so I think if those gates can be open to where we don't when we are in that state of I need help and I'm
Mm-hmm.
reaching out, uh and psychology aside, and just getting into cultural connection, I think that
Mm-hmm.
if we can see that happening, that and I don't know what it's derived. Another way to look at it perhaps is there are um, belief system like Unitarian Universalists and certain sects of Christianity that are open-minded in a sense that they interpret Christianity in a particular way that allows for really good and efficient sense-making, way-making, things like that, and heuristics that help enrich the person rather than making them feel guilty for being born or whatever. It's that they get into that idea of the agape and the kairos and the things that are really valuable in that particular system, and the love of Christ and all these things that they can, so the narrative of the story of the sacrifice, which is, like we can look at Neoplatonism as the grounding of
Mm-hmm.
that, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and how to be with the logos through the psyche as the intermediary of the new, all this which is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all this kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and have it done in a healthy, proper way. And I've seen small blips of reformation in those systems, like in Christianity. There's people like Richard Rohr and Brother Thomas Merton, who's been gone for a long time, but they were seeing through some of the boundaries of the guilt and the dogma, and more
Mm-hmm.
to the transcendence and the religio that religion's supposed to be. Or so anyway, so I see there are psychotechnologies in place, there are systems in place, that just with a little tweaking, can maybe afford that space to or the community to
I
allow that to
absolutely
happen.
agree. And, it starts with small, but what seem like small actions, but that
Hmm.
have huge repercussions. I mean, I sort of got by accident into this kind of YouTube world, but once you're in, you start to realize there's a few names that come up. They've come up here, like there's Levin, there's Vivek, there's these different little groups, right? And they have Lex Friedman or something, or Jordan Peterson, or these
Mm-hmm.
these people who in certain groups you can't really say their name, and other groups it's kind of like they're incredibly respected. And so I think of those people that they're in a very powerful position right now, and I don't mean as individuals, but in terms of the way they're orienting what paths and what ways will be open in
Mm-hmm.
the future.
Mm-hmm.
So every little decision they make, whether it's what they put on their thumbnail, if they're going to incite a certain, because we all know in YouTube, if you put certain words on your thumbnails, they're more likely to get clicked. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a fine balance between how much are you just trying to get attention. By the way, also, a lot of people, this is their life now, so you need that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're gonna, if you've, this has become your career. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong to try to get likes and connects, or not likes, but to get views and to develop a community. In fact, I'm
Right.
saying the opposite. But how do we do that? I start to face it myself a little bit, just like how do you, I mean, I haven't tried to monetize and all that stuff yet, but I'm presented with it. And so it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, where do you, right now I'm just doing it out of pure intention of curiosity and trying to learn. But when you see how fast it goes and moves, and that you do become a person that a lot of people are listening to, or that whatever, somebody with like the names I said, where the thumbnail that they create, or the way they orient their conversation, or how they kind of use that attention they're getting, or how much they push, they try to be healing or connect people versus kind of just doing what would probably get the most views.
Mm-hmm.
Those little decisions that every one of us and them in all our different scales are negotiating every day, I think that matters the most right now because it's setting the way forward for all these
Mm-hmm.
people that are listening, and it changes that music and that tonus in
Mm-hmm.
incredible, powerful ways. So how do those individuals who now are doing amazing work have a voice? How are they going to deal with that? Are they going to be able to sit with it and find ways to do it that orients us in healthier ways that we're talking about right now? It's hard work, and
Yeah.
especially when you have to make money and you have to make a living, you got to feed your family, you got to keep writing papers and like this is not easy stuff.
Yeah.
But the power is there, the opportunity is there,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's a lot of good people that really do not we can't always be perfect, but we can help each other. We
Yeah.
can be the constraints on each other. We can keep communicating and asking one another why we're doing things, and
Mm-hmm.
we can
Mm-hmm.
we can create that tonus together that so that when you're doing things that are positive and healthy, they can still be motivating and critical thinking and exciting and making money. We can
Yeah.
we can create all that together, but
Yeah.
it's up to us, right?
It
And
is. It because it's a project. It's in its Markov blanket, if you will. It's a project
it
that
is.
yeah, we
Mm-hmm.
understand um, to some degree what the parameters of the project are,
Mm-hmm.
and I would also add because everything you said was 100%. I'm on board 100%. But the consumer of that which is turned out by those people is an important part of that. In that the consumer um, really on board what's going on and then develop in a sense that they see the bigger picture, they see a sort of meta perspective or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
so that they are influenced in the best possible way. So in other words, if somebody's little bits of like okay, let's say I had social relevance and some of my neuroses start to show up that they see beyond the neuroses and they say that,
Yeah.
well, there
Or
was
they
the
open the space and let it be what it is, and they
right,
see how
right.
you've dealt with it or whatever. Yeah.
Right. It's like rock stars that we know. Like
Yeah.
I'll say Frank Zappa, he was an asshole, but he was a
Mm.
genius. And so you have to bracket the misogyny and the nasty attitude that he had and just and
Or don't
enjoy the
bracket, just say it's not
it's
what you
it's the
want,
whole
and
system. Well,
he
I
wasn't
just
strong enough to deal with it, right?
right, temporarily
It's
bracket,
not
but I mean
why he was famous. That's the
yeah.
confusion we make.
Yeah, he was famous because he could play the guitar and he could
Right.
orchestrate and
And
compose.
what he gave, the moments he
Right.
gave things.
So I would map that I would lay that down on top of the idea that if you get this intellectual or academic who breaks out, has
Mm.
relevance, but they bring some of their humanness with them, the
Yeah.
flaws and the vulnerabilities in that, and again in the less pleasant contextual way, that we have to love and embrace them and observe what's going on and just be holistic about it and say, oh,
Yeah, I
okay,
agree. A lot
yeah,
of these people are showing us they're going through all this stuff in public. It's not easy, and that's a
mm-hmm,
learning experience, and that we should, I'm not like that we learn not to judge them and judge each other as we move on.
mm-hmm,
I think one thing I do find very beautiful and hopeful about a lot of these controversial so-called people, but people who've clearly touched and changed and helped a lot of lives, is that even, of course, with all the flaws and the things that I really disagree with that they say at times or whatever, all that should be said and stated and pushed
mm-hmm,
against.
mm-hmm,
However, overall, a lot of it, like Sam Harris, or I mean, I won't name all the names, but there's a sense of trying to be mindful, of
mm-hmm,
trying to think critically,
yeah.
of trying to do what you just said, to learn how to be a consumer in a different way, to think about how's my body embodied feeling when I'm hearing this, or when I'm on this app, or when I'm engaging in this community. Is it really, I think about the desirable unknown again. Is it really the unknown that I desire? Do I want more of this?
Mm-hmm.
And they are trying to teach us, like in their flawed ways, all of us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are
Mm-hmm.
how to do that, how to think critically, how to sit with who we are, how to be vulnerable, how to be mindful. I do think there's a movement towards that, even with all the flaws and messed up stuff and
Yeah.
strange,
Yeah. Well,
things that
that's
need to be called out.
yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to love again, because if you
It
recognize
does.
the dissonance and the blind spots in somebody that you find important to you, it's like it's marriage,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
in a sense, my partner puts up with me,
yeah.
and I love her, unconditionally. And so yeah, you can just kind of extend that out to this other thing. It's the same process, I think, that, if because I can be very critical of Sam Harris, but I also find Sam Harris to be very intriguing because he's a very intelligent person. He's a very good word smithy kind of person. He speaks very eloquently, which is one thing I
Hmm.
really like about him. But he has,
Yeah.
I think there's things that where he's just dissonant in some ways, or dogmatic in some ways for someone who claims to be a captain of reason. So I could be critical, but then again, when I say bracket, I mean I just set it aside for a moment and then see with clarity through the taking that one layer off, and the opacity
Hmm.
is now cleared up a little bit. So I don't use that opacity against them, or that layer that adds to the clarity or whatever. So
Yeah,
so yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So
And that goes back to that space we were talking about at the beginning where I think we were talking about Sam Harris somehow here, but from his perspective, right? Like I don't think if he's in a healthy place and he's in this place of love, which
hmm
uh we've been lucky enough to know in our partnerships, and I think he has too. And what I think he really experiences with his listeners at the best, then your criticism would be helpful to him. It wouldn't be
mm,
something he's pushing away, right? Because
right.
we wouldn't have to say that it's like a either or, that he has to be always right or always wrong.
Mm,
It's the whole dialogue that's important,
yeah,
and that he's ultimately trying to open up. So if he's at his best, right, then there's nothing wrong with you not agreeing with what he says. It's the conversation itself. It's
yeah.
that what you described, that yin yang, that dialectic, that
hmm
engaging, co-creating of one another, that process that is the important thing. Not that he's said the right thing or that you've said the right thing, but that you're trying to co-create something better together, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's the beauty of dialectic, is that it's not about me or you, it's about the matter, or,
Yeah.
or the subject being discussed, and that it forwards itself through us as a third entity or agent or
Hmm.
whatever. So
And
yeah,
that's where the love, that's love, like with
yes,
you and your partner, with me and my
right.
partner, with any of our relationships, when we're doing that in that
Mm.
spirit and presence and awareness, gosh, it's so wonderful to be alive. It's not easy, but it's so wonderful. And
Yeah.
especially the more time and space that you share, and
Yeah.
continue to do that. It
Yeah.
grows. It's that real power that we were
hmm
talking about.
Yeah, it's like a dynamic personhood, because
Hmm.
we are layers
Hmm.
of our histories that make us a self, in a sense. It's one aspect of self.
Hmm.
But then when you have another person, whatever the relationship is, that if you are building those layers together, that poly personhood, this dynamic
Hmm.
personhood is emerging from that, and again, that to me goes into a kind of extended mind, kind of extended emotion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think,
Because we do it in our personal, I mean, we're talking about very intimate relationships where our
hmm
bodies are together daily,
yeah,
but even with the people we listen to on podcasts, we walk around and we have their voices in our ears, including both of us, by the way, sometimes. I mean,
yeah,
that's an intimate experience, and you are engaging at best in a kind of love together with the
right.
listener or with your conversation partner or whoever. It's a different kind of experience than the one that's intimate with your partner. But at
hmm
the same time, it's a similar, like at its best, you're still trying to kind of help each other do that so that when you're in those real vivid life relationships, you've added something to that or helped each other with that, We do
hmm
that, and that's why those voices that we were talking about, and your voice and all these are so important because
yeah,
none of that's discontinuous, right?
right, right.
Yeah.
And here's some more of
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
And as some of these folks do, to their credit, they bring to prominence the other. They'll bring somebody who may not have the social capital or relevance or whatever, and they'll bring them up and they'll say, this is
Yeah.
this person. And guys like Vervaeke and few other Levin, he's brought people on to have conversations with. So yeah, it's connections, it's connections, it's connections.
Yeah, yeah, I
And
absolutely agree. And that community of support, I think, is very important, of people like just trying to find people who are trying to do something similar like that and having a good discussion with them. And yeah, there's something very gracious in that, and also good for both sides. I mean,
yeah,
they we everyone is winning in that situation.
yes,
Mhm.
yes. And I think that's one thing we can put in the plus column of our actions and phenomenology and moving through experience and stuff like that. We're
Agreed.
creeping up on 2 hours here.
Yeah, how about that?
I don't even think we've scratched the surface of what you and I could talk about, but I think for the sake of our audience, perhaps if we want to hit pause on this for now,
Yeah.
and I think you said you're busy this summer, but maybe if I could bring you back in a few weeks, maybe into the fall, and again, I have a number of questions for you that I want to explore because you have a neuroscience background, you have a philosophy background. We talked briefly about second order observers and prophilicity and
Hmm.
identity. That's neat. I think again that deep continuity, like what we use the word intelligence, but can we play around with ideas about what
Hmm.
anyway. So
There's so much to say on
oh
that.
my
And I
gosh,
could
yeah.
also, I mean, I'm finally getting a few texts together that explain things a bit better. So maybe
Okay.
that would help too to
I could
connect
onboard
some
some ideas
ideas
from
and
you.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that would be good. And so if you're good, if this was a good experience, let's plan on that. And I would love to have you back and have a conversation again because like I said, I could keep asking you questions and learning from you. So if
It's been
you're
wonderful
if you're
to be
game,
here with you. And
well,
yeah, I
thank you.
really appreciate you and this space and time. And of course, I would love to talk to you again in
Okay.
the fall. Yes,
Okay. I would
definitely.
appreciate that because again, you have a lot to offer. And I say this.
Same to you, Justin. So do you.
Well, what I like to think of myself as a conduit. I gather
Hmm.
stuff and I just put it out there for the little chunk that I can have exposed to others. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, if I can serve that purpose, then oh my gosh, that would help me sleep better at night and feel good about where we're moving to. And again, when I'm sprung from my coil, there is this legacy, and it'll live on in YouTube, and people can discover things. If, again, not to keep getting into mortality, but I like to live that. Yeah, I like to think, what did you leave
No,
what
if it
did you leave the
motivates
world with?
you, it's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I was less jerk and more nice guy. So,
I think we do. We help each other. We help ourselves by having these kind of projects. We also keep ourselves on a track that we want and orient ourselves better. So yeah, you're giving. If your intention is to give and to kind of continually engage in this process we discussed, and what better way to do it than this?
yeah, this is a beautiful medium. I absolutely love it. And I
Hmm.
just recently onboarded Spotify.
Oh,
So
good.
one of my guests was like, he wrote me a week or two after, and he's a criminologist. And he's like, a lot of my friends and peers want to hear it on Spotify. Would you be able to do that? And I said, yeah. So I just uploaded 115 conversations over to Spotify, which is
Wow.
very easy. It took like 3 days or something with
Oh,
like an
good.
hour at a time. Yeah, and so I got it done. And so now there's another medium or platform that
Oh,
can
that's
get that
great.
out there. Yeah, because I know I get that when I'm at work, I have a very tedious, mind-numbing job, and I just put podcasts on, and
Audio.
yeah, and I just
Yeah.
listen.
And
So,
weirdly, sometimes it's even better with audio. Like it's good to you can listen to it in video and audio, and it'll be a different experience. So I think
I
it's
think
it's good
so.
you have it for audio.
I
There,
think so.
I've
Yeah.
had that even with my own conversations when I sometimes I listen to it in audio before I edit it, and it's very different than if I'm watching it on video.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's a different. Yeah,
You just
it's a
notice
different
different
means.
things, I guess. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm glad it's going to be I can listen to you on podcast soon too, because I did
Yes.
search and I didn't find it, but that was maybe before you'd put it all up, or maybe it was
Okay.
the
Yeah.
wrong
Maybe it was.
podcast service.
Okay. I'll send you the link.
Okay,
Especially
great.
because you're gonna be on here, and if you want to promote it,
Yeah, yeah. I think
cross-pollinate
I
it on
searched it
your
on Apple, not
socials.
Spotify. I
Oh,
have
okay. Yeah.
both, so
Yeah. I started with Spotify, and maybe I'll branch out into other things. Maybe I'll get the link
yeah,
tree eventually. All these
yeah.
kind of
At
things.
least one step at a time, but it's good you have
Yeah.
it out there.
Absolutely. Andrea, this has been
All right.
such a wonderful
It
conversation. And I
has. Thank
knew
you,
it would be
Justin.
because I researched you and there was this asymmetrical knowing, and now the
Yeah,
symmetry is there. And like I said, I think for another conversation we can just hop right into it and continue. But
absolutely.
I plan on learning from you in the future, and I look forward to the work that you're doing. And I don't say that at the expense of your history. You've done a lot so far, but I think your roots are spreading out into the world. So
Yes.
and I
Thank you.
encourage yeah, I thank you too. So I'll say goodbye to you after we stop record, but to the YouTube audience, thank you guys so
Okay.
much
Bye, everyone.
for
Nice
your
to meet
attention.
you.
Yeah, nice to have met you.
Mhm.
All right, where's my pause? There we go.